But we just wanted to give you a little background on the reentry strategy report, on where we are today and how we've gotten here. And this is from a systems level. And Renee Muir and Bill are going to join me in this conversation. So the first Building Bridges was 2003. And that's when we were working with the Council of State Governments, and Mike Lawler was Chair and Judiciary, Bill was Appropriations, and we were trying to put together a comprehensive strategy that looked to change the system, that looked to, Germano was, we were talking earlier, Germano Kimbrough, it's amazing how far we've come since those little roundtables that we had when Bill was chairing appropriations. Said, let's start talking about how we can change the pardons process. Let's start talking about how we can, change the parole process. Let's start talking about how we can do reentry. And the first Building Bridges was conviction to employment, building bridges from conviction to employment. And it is a little frustrating. I'll have to tell you, 16 years later, that so much of that work needs to be done still. And yet, in the same token, I'm not quite sure we were there as a state to do that work at that time. But I'm pretty sure we're here as a state to be able to really fulfill that mission now. And it's with people like Darrell's, people like Fred and Daid and others, the reentry counselors, all of us working together and talking about how we support this, not necessarily from the inside out, but from the outside in. How do we strengthen the very communities where people are coming back to and leaving from, to ensure that there's a system in place, that everybody has the 5-year plan that Darrell had. And so when we first put together the Building Bridges legislation, the Justice Reinvestment Act, what it had in it was a recommendation that there be a comprehensive reentry strategy. And at the time, as we were thinking about it, the best place that we thought that would be to develop it was the Department of Correction. Now, in 2006, when I first landed here at Central, we had the next Building Bridges conference. And it just so happened to be at the same time when we had the implementation report of the Justice Reinvestment Act, 04234. And what we found in that implementation report, and Renee was one of the authors, was that that reentry strategy had never been accomplished. That there wasn't a real clear sense of how that was going to get done. And so at that time, we were thinking, as we did from our perspective on the legislative side of things, how do we create legislation to actually move this forward? And so at that point, we came up with the idea of creating an oversight organization within the executive branch called the Criminal Justice Policy and Planning Division to be able to pull the system together, because the system was more than just DOC. It was DEMIS, it was a lot of state agencies, it was judicial, it was folks, the public defenders and prosecutors. How do we pull them all together to help with devise the reentry strategy? And so we gave that entity the role of devising the strategy. And Brian Austin, I don't know if he's here today, but I saw he registered, as he was the first one to fulfill that role under Governor Rell. And he did a good job of putting together a reentry strategy every year that he was there. But in the past 8 years, during the Malloy administration, that reentry strategy had not been accomplished. That wasn't done. There was a lot of things, as Darrell mentioned earlier, there were a lot of things that were accomplished, but there were those of us that were left wondering, what role are we playing? What's happening with reentry? We understand that prisons are closing. We understand that money is being saved from that. But what are we doing to impact that rate of return that we have not had a meaningful impact on in all this time? What are we doing with that? And that's when, again, it was Sue Gunderman, said, hey, remember that strategy? Why don't we ask OPM to see if we can help spearhead and get that produced, because we know there's a new administration coming in, and regardless of who is elected, we didn't know at the time, but we know that they wouldn't have it as much of a priority of criminal justice reform as the past governor had. It just wasn't their bailiwick. It wasn't what was the top of their agenda, and nor had they really had any experience within that system. And we weren't sure who was going to take over for Commissioner Semple or Mike. But regardless, it would most likely not be people that had 30-year histories with the system, and such is true. So we knew there was going to be a void. And we felt that something needed to be done to pull together these strings, to talk again about systems. What role are we all playing? How are we moving forward? How are we actually going to make this work this time? And so we went through a process, and Mike graciously agreed to allow us to convene a number of people. And I'll say, look, you know, we did our level best within the few months of the craziness that was the end of the administration, within the election cycle and everything, to do what we always try to do in this, to have an open table, to have everybody participate, to have it be transparent, to have it guided by the best practices and all the information we can provide. And we did our level best in producing this document. Now, do we know that there could be more people at the table? Yes. Do we know that this is a starting point? Yes. But it also was an opportunity and hopefully setting a direction that says, we are now going to pull this all together, and we're going to root it in the community. And Brian, as I mentioned before, and OPM, as they put together that reentry strategy before, they did it as the state is wont to do, and it's understandable. They looked across agencies and asked, you know, what are you doing? How are we going to do this? But as we know now, as so many of you have been telling us forever, we need to have it rooted in the people that are impacted by the system in order for it to work. We need to. And this can't be top down, and this has to be from the perspective of what are those very communities that people are going to, what are they going to do to demand of the system that people are prepared? And I don't think cities were in that position 15, 16 years ago. In fact, I know they weren't, because I was living in Hartford at the time, and every mayor at that time was running on public safety by saying, we need more police on the streets. And it's the same thing that's going on with the conversation on the juvenile car thefts. We need more police on the streets in order to do that. Do you realize there's only a small fragment of the kids that are doing that are actually caught? And the thought that further punishing them is going to do something about this issue? Why not root it in the very places? And you also know that this has been a fairly stagnant problem. This has not risen. Actually, in Hartford, there's far fewer thefts, car thefts, than there have been in the last 3 years. It's happening in some of the surrounding suburbs a little bit more, but those are the voices that are heard the most in these conversations sometimes. The last time that we had Dennis Schranz here was right after Cheshire, and everybody that's been a part of that system, probably everybody here today, knows what happened after Cheshire. The whole system stopped. And we were talking, Daryl, last night, there were people that were out 5 years that had owned houses, that were doing well, that got pulled back in. We're talking with Rob Hebert from Bridgeport, who was saying that the people that he was trying to get employed, the employers that he had relationships with, and lost faith in him because they couldn't trust that what he was saying about them remaining outside was true. They had invested so much in these individuals to know that the system just pulled it back. But where is that voice, that collective voice that says, no, that can't be? That can't be for the vast majority of people that are impacted by this. That can't be. It can't be the anecdote. It can't be the small thing like the fellow walking away as Nuntuck the other day that drives this system. And kudos to the to the president of Asnuntuck for realizing that, for talking about the balance of folks that have succeeded and how that balance far outweighs that one individual. And that if we collectively come together and do this better, then we will have less and less of those one individuals walking away. But to think that we can turn that corner and go back to this idea of tough on crime and throwing money, good after bad, and never answering the question of, where does this end? Where does this end? What is your end point here? Because that was never answered in the tough on crime scenario. Are we going to have billions more spent on this? So what we're trying to do here with this reentry strategy, and what we're trying to do today, is say, how can we collectively come together now? There's so many of us doing such good work. There's so many of us that recognize the need. How can we make sure it's rooted in the people who are most impacted as well? So this is what we tried to do with the reentry strategy. We put it together. We presented on it, I think it was last month at the Legislative Office Building. It has not been sanctioned by OPM. This, we were hopeful that it was, but it's not, but that's okay, because it's out there, and it's a conversation, and we're going to make sure that it's a continued conversation. And so Renee is now going to talk a little bit about what are the very things that what are the implementation strategies, what are the goals with it, and then Bill's going to wrap it up, and then we're going to go into the panel in a little bit with the folks that are doing a lot of this work on the ground, that are the collective voices, the NAACP, the ACLUs, the Everyday Democracy, and there's a few others that have been added to that panel, and I'm hopeful that'll be a good conversation as well. Thank
you. Good morning. Can you see me over the... I'm going to kind of move to the side because I feel like I'm hiding. So my name's Renee Lamarck-Muir, and I am the unnamed researcher #1 who worked on this report. And a very smart person told me not to come up here and open with a joke because it never works and it's not funny. So I'm not going to tell a joke, but what I will say is that I started my career in law enforcement, and I ended up in Connecticut doing some government investigations, such things as why are we having prison riots and why are children dying in foster care. That evolved into criminal justice reform when I was lucky enough to start working with Bill Dyson and Andrew Clark. So I wrote a lot of the reports that they turned into some real-life reforms that impacted a lot of people. After that, after 20 years of doing that, I decided to go back to law enforcement to see if these reforms were really working. I started working for the Hartford Police Department, and it just dawned on me today after listening to Daryl's amazing speech that sitting in a patrol car, or spent most of my time in an unmarked as a detective, that you would see people that you had arrested, you pull up alongside them, roll down the window, and the first thing I would always say is, hey, welcome home. How you doing? You need a ride? Oftentimes they would say, no, miss, I can't be seen driving with you in a police car, but thanks anyway. I would sit in McDonald's, have a meal with them, have coffee. And it didn't dawn on me actually until today that it just seemed like the natural thing to do, but that's the right thing to do. So I'm not saying all police officers do that, but many of the police officers that you don't hear about every day, many of the detectives you don't hear about every day, do say welcome home, and I hope you do what you need to do, and I'm here if you need me. So now moving on to the reentry strategy. Now I get to talk about the nuts and bolts of what we did. So as Andrew said, we had a process where we had a lot of people coming in. I went out into your communities. I met with your reentry roundtables. I met with organizations. I talked to groups of justice-involved people to hear their stories. We talked with state agencies and the staff in state agencies. And in the very short period of time that we had, we took all of your information and we tried to pull it together and put it in a report so that it could be read from beginning to end, and you can get a sense of where you all want to go. So we came up with some goals, and the goals are probably the goals that if you had to write them down individually, what you would come up with. So basically, we want to have a positive effect on justice-involved people, right? When they come into the community, have an effect on their families, and have a positive effect on their communities. We want to break the cycle, right, that in and out of prison that Daryl was talking about, and to break the cycle of just having contact with the justice system, that sort of negative contact with the justice system. And we do that in a number of ways, right? Good jobs, good housing, health care, and that includes mental health, substance abuse, as well as primary care, educational opportunities, restoration of the rights of citizenship, right? Voting rights, being able to travel, all kinds of rights. Engage families, right? These are the first stop for many people coming back, and when they have to go back into prison, those families are traumatized again. So we want to support those families, and then as well as community engagement. We recognize that the process of reentry begins at arrest, continues through discharge from incarceration, through community service, and then continues well beyond that, right? Well beyond the discharge of a sentence. So the impact of a criminal record could come back and haunt a person years after. Success depends on a multi-pronged approach. Andrew was touching on that a little bit. It involves state and municipal governments, communities, nonprofits, academic institutions, as well as justice-involved people and their families. So to meet those goals, the approach that came out through all the work we did was that the work had to be community-centric, right? It had to involve a variety of people and a variety of resources. And community-centric does not exclude state agencies, does not exclude the federal government, does not include faith-based, academics. It's just a community-centric approach. Collaboration to provide technical assistance and support. So some entities, organizations, agencies have the experience, the resources, the knowledge to do things that other organizations don't. For example, a big one that came up is grant writing, right? The state is usually pretty good at grant writing and getting funds. Smaller organizations, nonprofits, they don't have the resources to have the people on staff, those grant writing people that know how to do that magic. They don't necessarily have them on staff. So a sharing, a blending of those resources is what's needed here. To pursue federal, state, municipal, and private funding sources. This is not going to be funded exclusively by the state, right? We're still in a budget crisis mode here in Connecticut. We don't know how long that's going to last. So funding has to come from all different sources. In some cases, it has to be pooled and shared. And in a lot of cases, we have to look to reduce some of the competition for those fundings, right? So if one agency is better suited to get that funding, right, a larger agency shouldn't come in and kind of like eat, the bigger fish eats the smaller fish and all the way down. There should be a sharing and a pooling of resources. And then equal attention to prevention efforts, right? We're talking a lot about reentry here. That's the focus of all of this. But there's a movement now on no entry, right? So reducing or preventing contact with the justice system, especially of young people. So after that, we have our goals, we have our process, and then we have the plan, right? So the plan was pretty comprehensive, and we focused on several need areas. So we want to improve the availability of housing, improve job opportunities, make people better prepared to get higher paying jobs, skilled jobs, and just better prepared on how to get a job and then how to keep a job, right? All the things you need to know about keeping and maintaining your employment. Improving health outcomes, mental health, substance abuse, and primary care. Help people gain access and to maintain government assistance for them and their families. maintain people's connections with their families while they're incarcerated and when they come home, right? And to support those families during any periods of incarceration and during the transition. Improve access to basic community resources. So a lot of you, that's the work you do every day. And we wanted to recognize that, and we want to figure out ways to better resource you and to make what you do, to expand what you do to a larger pool of people. And continue to improve reentry the transition planning that DOC does, the Board of Parole does, CSSD and the judicial branch, they help with that too. So improve sort of that state process. So the counselors that Daryl was talking about and the work and the wardens and the programs that Daryl was talking about, improve that process so that it's focused on reentry and not necessarily just focused on sort of managing or keeping people busy while they're incarcerated. And then expedite some of the initiatives that DOC's Parole Division, Parole and Community Services Division is doing. So they've got some initiatives that are national best practices. They're being done all over the country, and they're just starting to initiate them here in Connecticut. And so there's a lot of expertise here in the state between DOC and CSSD in using, and the Board of Parole in using these. So it just doesn't need to be, we feel like it doesn't need to be such a long ramp up, right? That we should just sort of dive in with these. So Andrew's going to talk a little bit more later on about coordination and oversight, but one of the things that became very clear is that, like in 2003 and 2004, when the state was focusing on reentry and justice reinvestment, there needs to be someone that's driving the bus, right? And so it's not the job of one particular state agency, it's not the job of one particular branch of government, and it's not the job of one particular municipality. It sort of crosses all those boundaries. So there needs to be somebody that can pull all of that together and see where duplication of efforts is happening, where there's a lack of resources, where policy may be sort of bumping up against another policy. There's all kinds of things. So there needs to be some sort of coordination. So we have some language in the report. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because Andrew's going to talk about it later, but that's one of the first strategies that we think there needs to be. And the consultant, Dennis, is going to really do a deeper dive on this and later this afternoon, so it's important to stick around for the end of the conference. Housing, we had, so each need area has a bunch of different strategy directions underneath these. These are not recommendations. These are not, and blank shall do this, or this is going to happen, or legislation shall be passed to do this. These are based on the information we're receiving for you, these are the kind of things that need to happen to make improvements in housing, employment, and as we go through the need areas. In the report, there's also these little text boxes. I think the report's in your packet, but you'll see in the text boxes we highlight programs that are happening in another state or happening on a national level that show promise in each of the needs areas. Again, those are just sort of ways to prompt thinking, discussion, ideas, maybe look into those programs, see if they can translate into Connecticut, but they're just meant to help you think about these broader strategic directions. So under housing, it's collaborate with the entities that focus on housing. Coordinate with public housing. There's a lot of different rules or policies or practices in public housing surrounding people with criminal records and their families. So try to find shortcuts or ways to make improvements, ways to consider allowing people with criminal justice involved people with records to come back to live with their families. Encourage development of more housing options for people as they leave prison. The state agencies that are informed about this area provide technical assistance to housing authorities so that housing authorities understand the difficulties that people with criminal records face when they want to either move back in with their families or that they want to obtain housing, stable housing, and offer counseling and support to families around housing. The next area was employment, so we kind of went from the big ones that stabilize a person, and you'll see then we work down. These are not in an order of priority, but there are some that are immediate concerns. Employment is coordinate with the Commission on Equities and Opportunity. They have some recommendations around livable wage. Provide vocational training to meet the needs of the labor market, right? Where are the businesses in Connecticut, or what are the businesses in Connecticut that are needing employees, and how can people with criminal records sort of find their way to those jobs? What kind of training do they need? What sort of assistance do they need? Develop and expand supportive employment programs with persons with disabilities, and require laws, this is sort of the ban the box laws, so look at the laws around that and see if some amendments could be made, right? The Sentencing Commission is looking at the boards and commissions that issue occupational licenses. They all have some kind of requirement that a person with a criminal record or a person with a felony conviction may not be eligible or may not be suitable, so they're looking into that to see if they can improve those laws. And consider legislation for expedited pardons and expungement of records. Mental health, look at the assessment and the service delivery of mental health, primary care, substance abuse, increase access to community-based care, and I know that's going to be wrapped up all around kind of funding and insurance money. Provide culturally competent and holistic health care. Encourage the use of trauma-informed interventions. Educate mental health providers on the psychological effects of being incarcerated. And provide people who have mental health prescriptions, provide them with a way to gap that as they transition back into their communities. If they're on supervision, that transition is supervised, but people coming off of supervision or people who come out at the end of the sentence or pretrial people who come out, find a way to give them a sufficient amount of their prescriptions to get until they get into a primary care situation. Government entitlements. So this is basically finding ways to assist justice-involved people to get entitlements to help them with the transition until they can find employment, find housing, till they can stabilize, right? And they're having a livable wage. But work with the agencies and the organizations that do this, right? The criminal justice system is not as informed, right? They don't work in this every day, so have some coordination and find ways to get people the entitlements that they need. Family support, there's lots of lots of strategic directions in here, but they all center around how to improve and help that connection with family and how to keep that connection while people are incarcerated and while they're transitioning out. Maybe they're still not in their transition or their supervision, they're still not yet living with their families, but finding ways that they can communicate with either their significant other, their spouse, their parents, most importantly, their children, but as well as as well as communicating, for example, with their children's teachers or their children's pediatricians. So finding that, keeping them in that loop so that they understand and that they're part of and they can contribute to their family. Access to services, right? So this area really focused on the exceptional work that the roundtables are doing in the state. So some of the strategic directions are increasing the number of roundtables, increasing the number of communities, municipalities that create and support a roundtable in their area. Open the reentry resource centers, commonly known as a Welcome Center, the Hartford Welcome Center, and is it Waterbury, New Haven, and Bridgeport also have this model. But have these welcome centers throughout the state. And establish forensic peer mentoring. Daryl talked about how that was very important to him. But when we looked at this model, we found that it's best practice being used across the country. And we found that these peer mentors could really be used in specific areas, right? They could be used in the courts, and they can help the pretrial people that are discharging who don't have any supports. They can also help the people that are reentering the end of sentence people. And then also have some sort of peer mentoring services in probation and parole case management, right? So that the parole officers and the probation officers can work with peer mentors to help support the people, the clients on their caseloads. Transition planning. So DOC has some new programs that they've been using the last couple of years, seem very successful. So the information around this is trying to expand that, right? Trying to have the DOC reintegration units in all of the facilities. Right now, they're just in certain facilities, so have them in all of the level 2 and 3 facilities where the majority of people, right, discharge from. And have reentry counselors, full-time reentry counselors at each of the facilities, including the jails. And they can help create those transition plans that Daryl created on his own, but sort of have that be part of the system. And parole, as I mentioned, parole case management. They're doing some really good initiatives around best practices. So just kind of really buy into that, implement it across the board, implement it for all of the people on parole case management that are eligible or suitable to receive these services. I know they have a plan to sort of slowly roll it out, but there's a lot of experience in CSSD. They've been doing this kind of stuff for decades. The Board of Parole has some experience with it, so we're kind of just saying, go for it. Okay. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Renee. I think Renee did a fantastic job. So I just again want to say thank you, Renee, for that. I just have one or two comments to make. And I know that my comments does not lend itself to the experience of many people here. But Andrew's comments reminded me about what my experience has been. And I know I've told this to people on numerous occasions. I've had contact with the system, and I've witnessed what can happen. And I have a granddaughter now, should be about 30, that the relationship is Zippo, emanating from her dad, who was away for 9 and unable to reestablish that relationship upon his return. So the family piece is monumental because it goes right down the line. Even though you may not witness it in your lifetime, it's there. It's there unless we're able to do something about it, do something with it. And that's a tough one. And as I was standing over listening to Renee talk and remembering what Daryl's comments were, so you know, people here today are people who are on the front line, who are into this because they're committed to it. You know that it's life for them. You know, it's just not something off the cuff. It means something. You know, so and I don't think we can say that enough. What I thought of, how many people remember Curtis Mayfield? Okay, I know. I hate to say it, but it's probably the older ones. But remember the song, Keep On Pushing. You know, move on a little higher. Somewhere, somehow, you've got to do that. And Curtis recognized that long ago. And, you know, we lost him. He had that accident and died. But that song just sticks in my mind. Keep on pushing. And that's what you ought to do. You know, we ought to, outside of this group here, we ought to be engaged in trying to get judges to understand. We ought to have a gathering like this where judges are to be talked to. We ought to have a gathering like this where prosecutors are to be talked to. Because it's difficult for some of us to really understand the implications associated with this entire issue. And they very well ought to be made to understand and witness as well. I know the Chris Rapillo is here today. She's a public defender, you know, so she understands, but she's trying to get to understand more of it. Others need to understand, and they need to get more of it. And you need to be the ones to lead that charge. There's not another group like you. There's not another group like you of people who are advocates, people who've lived it, who've done it, that exist in this place. And there ought to be the establishment of. I mean, when I say Curtis Mayfield, keep on pushing, who is it you're going to push? Who is it you're going to push? You've got to be pushing somebody. You've got to be pushing somebody. Find out who it is you think needs to be pushed and push. Regardless of who they are, push. Push. You've got to do that. If you don't do it, it ain't going to get done. If you don't do it, it's not going to happen. So be about the business of what Renee talked about with networking, what Andrew talked about, the networking, what Darrell talked about, the networking, getting to know each other and sharing, building coalitions, doing the job. So I just want to kind of give you that and have you know that I'm so pleased to see you here to be a part of this. Man, it does my heart good when I see people recognize one another and embrace and shake hands and talk and introduce themselves. It's new, it's good, it's good. We have to do more, do more. Remember Curtis Mayfield. Keep on pushing.
So it's been 20 years that Bill, Renee, and I have worked together. And I think you'll probably start to gather that we're making a pitch here. When we were at the legislature and garnering support to change the dynamic and the trajectory where we were going with sentencing laws, with how we were looking at, or finally starting to pay attention to the idea of people returning. You know, Renee wrote the first recidivism report in Connecticut. I'm not sure there had been one in the country until that point in 2001. People just were not talking about it. And the way, every day I learn from Bill Dyson, which is why I always keep him so close. Not only that, he's just a friend and a brother to me at this point, but you need all of the things working together to move this. You need the passion, but you also need the plan. You got to be able to put this all together. You need the people that go into the weeds. You need the people that have lived it. You need the people that are going to advocate for it. And the big question that I think we're asking you today is, can we come together? All of us, those various members of this team, and the way that we did in the legislature to start Justice Reinvestment, and do it as a community, and do it rooted in community, and come up with this grander plan, and maybe the reentry strategy is a part of it. That's what we're pitching today, but maybe it's something even bigger and more detailed. That's something Dennis will be talking about later. But the idea is that not one of us can do it alone, and not one of us will be as strong as the collective will be. And that's where I think we all believe up here we can and should and are poised to go. And we're really hopeful that this conversation today kicks us off in that direction. So speaking of which, I'm going to invite the next panelists up, actually the first panel up, and we're going to begin that conversation, because these are the folks that are doing this work every day at the Capitol. You'll see them a lot. They're great on social media. They're doing everything from educating larger populations to educating legislators to having their voice heard in public hearings to working in the weeds on particular issues as well. So I'd like to bring up all of our panelists, if they will, if they're here.